Hello, welcome to Theology Thursday. You probably noticed last week and may note this week that we're in the process of building a new studio for our weekly Theology Thursday. So please bear with us. It's still under construction and probably going to be another month or two before we get it all finished out. And so we're looking forward to being able to finish that up. But anyway, I appreciate Brian Bishop, who's done a lot of the construction on this, and then Abel Acosta, who's done a lot of the design and set work as well. So appreciate all the hard work they've done, along with some other people, Andrew Hobson and some others. So just want to give a shout out to them for the great job that they have done and are doing and will do. Today, I want to discuss a subject that comes up a whole lot in the Bible, and I think creates a great deal of confusion due to the terminology that's used, and that is the subject of leprosy. So leprosy in the Bible is described at length in Leviticus chapters 13 and 14. So if you read the entirety of those chapters, there are all these regulations about leprosy in the Bible. And I'm not going to read the entirety of the chapters, but I do want to note a couple things. Words that were used in the ancient world sometimes meant a broad group, and today we use it for a much narrower idea. So, for example, in the Bible, the word stars means any light in the heavens that's not the sun or the moon. We now know that there are planets and comets and meteors, and that sometimes what we call a star is actually a cluster of stars or a galaxy. You can see the band of the Milky Way. We have lots of varied understanding of all the different types of heavenly bodies. But in Bible times, the word stars just meant any light up there, and that was good enough. Any kind of heavenly light that was not the sun or the moon. Leprosy is like that. When we hear the word leprosy, we think of a modern disease that's also known as Hansen's disease, which attacks the nerves and the flesh, starts with the extremities. People lose feeling. Sometimes they actually lose limbs or parts of limbs and noses and ears, and it's a horrible, ugly, terrible disease that is fatal. The reality is leprosy in Bible times was probably not like that at all. The word leprosy, unfortunately for us, comes from a Greek word lepra that meant any kind of skin condition. And so the Bible just translated as leprosy when they did the King James, and it has just stayed that way with almost all translations. Many modern translations, I use the English Standard Version, actually has usually a footnote that will say, in the Bible, leprosy meant some kind of skin condition. And so one of the reasons why we know, a couple reasons why we know that leprosy in the Bible is much broader than just what we think of as Hansen's disease is because the descriptions of them are not what you have with modern leprosy. They sound like warts or something, if it has hair in it of different colors and things like that. And the other reason is that in the Bible, lepers move around. They don't seem to suffer a lot of pain and things that come with leprosy. And so if it was Hansen's disease, movement's very painful and difficult. And the longer you have leprosy, the more painful and more difficult it becomes. So leprosy was a broad term that kind of meant any kind of skin condition. But even more important, in Leviticus 13 and 14, leprosy is related to being unclean. And unclean doesn't always mean sinful. Right? Usually it doesn't mean sinful. Unclean just means I can't go into the temple complex. I can't in the tabernacle and then later in the temple. I can't go in there because I'm ritually unclean. So if your dad died and you were a part of burying him, you've now touched a dead body, you're unclean. Well, it's not a sin to help bury a loved one, but you'll be ritually unclean. And so there are a number of things that would make you ritually unclean that follow like almost immediately after Leviticus 13 and 14. So I'll give you some examples, like from Leviticus 15. In verse 16, we read this. If a man has an emission of semen, he will bathe his whole body in water, and he'll be unclean until the evening. And every garment, every skin on which the semen comes will be washed with water and be unclean until the evening. If a man lies with a woman and has an emission of semen, both of them will bathe themselves in water and be unclean until the evening. So there's nothing sinful going on here, assuming that it's his wife, of course, but it is a ritual like a cleansing. So Leviticus 15, beginning verse 19. I'm not read the whole thing because it goes on forever, but a woman's menstrual cycle makes her ritually unclean, not sinful, just ritually unclean, not able to go into the temple. After a woman has a child, Leviticus chapter 12, verses 1 through 5. It's really an interesting passage. The Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "Speak to the people of Israel, saying, if a woman conceives and bears a male child, then she'll be unclean 7 days. At the time of her menstruation, she'll be unclean, or as at the time. And on the 8th day, the flesh of his foreskin will be circumcised. Then she shall continue for 33 days in the blood of her purifying. She shall not touch anything holy, nor come into the sanctuary until the days of her purifying are completed. But if she bears a female child, then she shall be unclean 2 weeks, as in her menstruation. And she shall continue in the blood of her purifying for 66 days. And so she hasn't committed any sin, she hasn't done anything wrong, just ritually unclean. And all this was done to show the people that it is not easy to get into the presence of God. God is a holy God. And so there are these requirements, all these things, and at some point you begin to realize, wow, nobody's going to get in God's presence. Exactly. That's why we need grace. That's the driving force behind all of these rules and regulations. Is not, oh man, I got to keep all these or I don't get into heaven. It is, wow, this is a reminder of the purity and the holiness of God. That was kind of the idea. So leprosy is not really viewed in Leviticus 13 and 14 as a medical condition that needs to be treated as much as a ritually unclean or impure condition that needs to be treated. Now, there are a couple things we know that were not considered leprosy. So in verse 18 of Leviticus 13, if there is in the skin of one's body a boil and it heals. So if it's a boil, it's not leprosy. And then in verse 24, he's going to say, or when the body has a burn on its skin and the raw flesh of the burn becomes a spot, reddish, white, or white. So a burn was not considered leprosy. It's a skin condition, but it was not one of the ones that was considered in the purview of Leviticus 13:14. Now, one of the reasons we know this is not Hansen's disease is because garments could be leprous. What? Yes. Leviticus chapter 13, verse 47. It's just fascinating to me. When there is a case of leprous disease in a garment, whether a woolen or a linen garment, in warp or woof of linen or wood, or in a skin or anything that's made of skin, if it's greenish or reddish, and so there were garments could be. Now we would probably think of this as mold on the garments, or something like that. And then in chapter 14, verse 33. We're going to read about leprosy in a house, which would again probably be what we consider mold. The Lord spoke to Moses and Aaron, saying, "We come to the land of Canaan, which I give you for a possession. And I put a case of leprous disease in a house in the land of your possession. Then he who owns the house will come and tell the priest." So the house is now unclean. Now we recognize that mold, mildew are also health conditions. But again, the perspective here is about holiness, and that you have to do all these things to be reminded about the holiness of God and all that kind of deal. The only time we find any indication of a health issue is in chapter 13, verses 45 and 46. And this is what most people know about when they think about leprosy in the Bible. The leprous person who has the disease will wear torn clothes and let the hair of his head hang loose, so no man bun. And he will cover his upper lip and cry out, "Unclean, unclean." He will remain unclean as long as he has the disease. He is unclean. He will live alone. His dwelling shall be outside the camp. So this is the only indication of any kind of medical issue related to leprosy, that you tell people you're unclean. But again, it's about being ritually unclean. And if someone touches you, they become ritually unclean and cannot go into the temple. So even here, it may not be as much of a medical thing, don't want to quarantine to not spread disease, but we want to spread unholiness. We want to spread uncleanness. And so that's kind of the idea. So Leviticus 14, the first 32 verses, and I'm not going to read all of Leviticus 14, 1 through 32. You can read it on your own. Are elaborate rituals and things that have to be done to be declared clean from leprosy so that you can again go into the temple complex and again move and function around people. Now, you've probably kind of figured out by now, I'm driving home this point, it's about ritual and being considered unclean and all the kind of things that, perhaps go with that. And that's true because that is the point. So here's what's fascinating. You start reading these regulations, and then you read the regulations about clean and unclean animals that are going to come up a little bit before this. And you start reading and go, man, nobody's going to be able to keep all of these. You're right. You're going to be unclean. You're going to eat unclean animals. You're going to touch something that makes you unclean. A woman's going to have her menstrual period, which makes her unclean. Husbands and wives are going to be intimate. It's going to make them ritually unclean. You're going to get skin spots. They're going to make you ritually unclean for a period of time. I mean, who in the world can follow all of this? Who can keep all of this? The answer is no one. So after all of these almost impossible to keep regulations, you get to Leviticus 16, which is the Day of Atonement. And the point of the Day of Atonement is, look, you couldn't keep all those regulations. No one can make themselves holy before God. Everybody is unclean. Everybody needs to be made clean. And the only way it's going to happen is through the death of a substitute. You and I are unclean. But we're not just ritually unclean, we're morally unclean. We cannot come into the presence of God on our own. We can't make ourselves clean. And so God sent a substitute, His Son, Jesus Christ. And so one of the reasons for these laws is not just to remind them of we need to be clean to get into God's presence, but to remind them of the impossibility of that. No one can remain clean. Everybody at some point becomes unclean. Everybody at some point not able to enter in the presence of God. Everyone needs the atonement of Leviticus 16. They need the atonement lamb and that blood that's poured out on the mercy seat for us to cleanse us completely. And so it's really cool to see how the leprosy stuff all leads up to that, and a reminder that the law tells us, wow, we cannot earn our salvation. We need the atonement because we are morally unclean and ritually unclean, and in such desperate need of that. And so really interesting to read about leprosy, but also to think about in the context of the way the Bible really presents it, which is a ceremonial uncleanness, and then all that represents to us about the holiness of God, how we can't get into His presence, and how God provides that for us through the atonement goat in the Old Testament, and then ultimately, of course, through the final Lamb of God, who is Jesus Christ. So I hope this is encouraging you today, helps you understand a little bit about leprosy, but also encourage you as you to think about how incredible it is that even though we are unclean, God has declared us clean in Jesus Christ. So God bless you. I hope you have a fantastic day, and I hope that this weekend will be great for you as well.